In 1916, an adventure magazine reporter named Milt Macklin flew to New Guinea with his film crew to shoot a documentary about a missing person. Milt's hope was that he was actually going to find this missing person and capture it on film, really pushing his documentary over the top. But despite shooting all this footage and looking all over the place in New Guinea, they never actually found the missing person. So Milt ultimately went back home and just kind of put the film in storage and never watched it. Well, 40 years later, that footage would get pulled out of storage because another film crew wanted to make their own documentary about this missing person. And when they watched this footage, they found something totally unbelievable on it. So today, I'm going to tell you the story of what they found in that footage, and then, more importantly, I'm going to tell you what this footage revealed about the missing person. And I will say now, it is highly disturbing. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast. Because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please point at the Amazon Music follow, but unshirt and tell them they have something on it. And then, when they look down, just flick them in the nose. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the morning of Saturday, November 18th, 1961, a 23-year-old man named Michael Rockefeller reached down and grabbed the pull cord that was connected to the outboard motor that was on the boat that Michael was riding in. And Michael, he pulled and pulled on that cord, but he could not get this engine to restart. It just sputtered and wouldn't turn over. And without power, that meant that Michael and his small crew just continued to drift farther and farther out to sea. But that wasn't even the worst of the situation. The boat that Michael and his crew were on, which was a 40-foot-long catamaran, it was two handcrafted canoes tied together, well, it was starting to sink. Minutes before, Michael and his crew had been happily traveling along the beautiful green, jungled coast of New Guinea, when they had to cross over this area where the water was particularly turbulent. There was this river in New Guinea that was feeding out to the Arafura Sea, which is where Michael and his crew were. And where this brown river met the blue water, it became very choppy with lots of rough waves. And so as Michael and his crew tried to cross that area, the waves came on board, they flooded the engine, it shut off. And then, as more and more waves landed inside the boat began to sink. The reason why Michael and his crew were even out here and taking these chances to begin with is because Michael wanted to go see this tribe called the Asmat that lived in New Guinea, basically right past this area where this river was. They lived right on the coast. Michael was obsessed with the artwork that the Asmat tribe created, in particular, the very unique bis pole. These poles are created by the master carvers within the Asmat tribe. What they do is they take a single piece of wood and they etch it away until it looks like it's a bunch of men standing on each other's shoulders. Now, these bis poles are totally beautiful and intricate and wonderful to look at. But the Asmat tribe doesn't make them for art. They make them because they believe they contain the souls of the warriors from their tribe who have been killed in combat. And until the Asmats avenge these down warriors, basically until the tribe kills their enemies, these souls remain trapped in these bis poles. Which means the Asmats don't really ever get rid of these poles. They don't sell them, they don't throw them away. They are just part of their culture and society. But months ago, Michael had come and visited the Asmat tribe. He had learned about these bis poles and what they meant, and he believed he had successfully negotiated a deal where he would barter some of his own goods in order to get one of their bis poles. But even though Michael gave them all the things he had offered, they had not, in return, sent the bis pole. And so now, Michael was coming back to hopefully be able to claim the bis pole and take it with him. But as Michael sat in his sinking catamaran, watching the muddy shores of New Guinea get farther and farther away as he drifted farther and farther out into the Arafura Sea, the last thing on his mind was the bis pole. He needed to figure out what they were going to do. Michael's crew consisted of 3 other people. There was a French anthropologist named René, and there were 2 teenagers who were actually Asmat guides, and their names were Simon and Leo. And so, after Michael was unable to start the engine up, all 3 of them took their turn yanking on the cord, but they too could not get it to start. Finally, Simon and Leo spoke up and they said to Michael and René that, at this point, they believed their only hope was abandoning the catamaran, jumping into the ocean, and swimming to shore, which, for now, was about a half-mile away. But they weren't drifting so quickly out to sea that, if they waited any longer, they might be too far away to actually make that swim. But Renee was not a good swimmer at all, and Michael was just not ready to totally abandon ship and leave this thing out here to sink, because on board the catamaran was all this stuff he had brought along, like tobacco and fishing line and clothes and candy and all this different stuff that he knew this tribe wouldn't have, and he could use it as leverage to continue bartering to get his bispole and to get other artwork they might be offering. And so, even though Michael understood that obviously, this catamaran and everything on it is going to sink into the ocean at some point. He just wasn't there mentally to jump off now and just kind of abandon all this stuff. And so, a decision was made that the two Asmat guides, the two teenagers, Simon and Leo, they on their own would jump out, swim to shore, and try to get help, while Michael and Renee stayed back and waited for that help to come. And so, a few moments later, the two teenagers jumped into the water and began their long swim to shore. And as they did, Michael watched, and it suddenly dawned on him just how far away he was from his own home. It had been months since Michael had last showered, so he smelled terrible. He was totally sunburned and caked in dirt, and his hands were rough and calloused from all the rowing he was doing. But this was not really Michael's real life, because Michael was not from New Guinea or from anywhere near here. He was actually from America, where his family was one of the most well-known, influential, and richest families ever, like in the history of humanity. The Rockefeller family are in, like, the top 10 of the most powerful people ever. Michael's grandfather was the oil tycoon John D. Rockefeller, who at the time was literally the richest man in the world. And Michael's father, Nelson Rockefeller, was at the time the governor of New York and the future Vice President of the United States. But despite having these unbelievable resources at his disposal, Michael was not compelled to kind of be a Rockefeller. Instead, he found his calling in the wilds of New Guinea. He had first come here 7 months earlier with a team of Harvard University filmmakers who were looking to document a very remote tribe, and Michael just fell in love with the adventure of this trip. Even though on this trip, while they were filming a battle between this remote tribe and another tribe and another tribe, and Michael got shot accidentally in the shoulder with an arrow. So, despite being wounded effectively in combat, Michael just loved being in New Guinea. In fact, Michael actually never told his family about getting shot in the shoulder with this arrow, because he was worried if he told his family, the all-powerful Rockefeller family, they would respond by seeking out retribution against one of these tribes that had inadvertently harmed Michael Rockefeller. And so, Michael was just very respectful and protective of the people he came in contact with in New Guinea, and, in many ways, he viewed them as more like his people than his family. And so, after the Harvard University filmmakers wrapped up their documentary and went back to America, Michael had stayed in New Guinea. And in the meantime, his father, Nelson Rockefeller, had opened up a museum back home in New York called the Museum of Primitive Art. And what it displayed was artwork from places like New Guinea. Now, this was the early 1960s, and so many Westerners viewed natives of New Guinea, like the people of the Asmat tribe, as being very primitive and backwards. And so, as a result, there was a lot of people that were drawn to this new museum in New York just for the spectacle of it, to see what these primitive, backwards people were creating. But Michael felt like he had a deeper understanding of the natives of New Guinea, and he felt like it was his responsibility to go out and find the incredible artwork all around New Guinea, including like the bispoles from the Asmat tribe. Send that artwork back to his father to be put up in this museum so that it was more than just a spectacle. Michael wanted the people of the West to appreciate and respect the natives of New Guinea the same way he did, and he believed through art he could do that. And so Michael had teamed up with Renee, the French anthropologist, to go all around New Guinea to find this artwork to send back to his dad. A few hours after Simon and Leo had leapt off the sinking catamaran and began their swim to shore, Michael and Renee had no idea if they had even made it to shore. They hadn't seen anybody show up to rescue them. And so, as far as they knew, they had no idea how close they were to being rescued or not. And as they looked down, they saw their catamaran was sinking lower and lower in the water. And so, at some point, Michael and Renee just grabbed buckets and began bailing the water out of the catamaran, which was totally useless. The water was coming in way too quickly, but they had nothing else to do. And so, they're bailing the water out, and then a rogue wave comes through and flips the entire catamaran over, sending Michael and Renee into the sea. And so luckily, Michael and Renee were able to swim to the surface. They swam over to the now upturned catamaran, but there was an air pocket kind of trapped underneath it, and so it was staying afloat. And so, Michael and Renee grabbed onto the catamaran, and Michael actually grabbed a gas canister that had come off the boat and he attached it to his belt like a flotation device. And so, he and Renee just kind of held onto this upturned catamaran. Michael was also supported by this gas canister, and they just continued to wait, hoping that Simon and Leo had made it to shore and that help would be arriving soon. But in the back of Michael's mind, he knew that if help didn't come soon, Michael might have to do something drastic, like attempt to swim himself, which now was way farther than half a mile away. By the next morning when the sun came up, Michael and Renee were still in the water, holding onto that catamaran, waiting for help to arrive. But no help had come. Now, Michael was a very good swimmer, but by this point, he knew they were at least 5 or maybe even 10 miles from shore. So, this would be a gargantuan swim in pretty rough waters. But you know Michael, he's a Rockefeller, he had a lot of confidence, and he began telling Renee that, hey, I'm gonna do the swim. I know I can do it. I can swim the whole distance, even if it's 10 miles. I can do it. You know, you're gonna have to just hang tight. It's gonna take a while, but I'll get us help. Renee begged Michael not to go, but Michael said, I have to do something, otherwise we're gonna die out here. And so, all Renee could do was watch as Michael stripped off some of his clothes and attached another gas canister to his belt to give him a little bit more flotation. And then Michael shook Renee's hand, and then, right around 8:00 a.m. on Sunday, November 1961, Michael began the swim. About 12 hours later, so that night, while Renee is still just holding onto this catamaran hoping help is going to come soon, suddenly, kind of without warning, the sky suddenly erupted with this incredibly bright flame. And what it was a plane flying overhead that had spotted Renee and the upturned catamaran. They had fired a flare into the air to be like, hey, we see you, we're gonna send help. And then, just a couple of hours later, a boat came around and picked Renee up. And when Renee climbed on board, he was so relieved and he asked the captain, hey, did Michael Rockefeller tell you I was out here? I was out here. Is that why you knew I was here? Oh. And the captain said, no, we were told by 2 teenagers, 2 guides, Simon and Leo, that you were out here. No one's heard from Michael. Now you need to remember that Michael Rockefeller was a Rockefeller. And so, as soon as Renee heard, oh my goodness, we don't know where Michael is, and he told the captain that Michael had begun this unbelievably long swim to shore to get help, it was like, suddenly, a bomb had gone off in the Rockefeller family, and they committed all of their money and their resources and their influence to launch the biggest manhunt, basically ever, to find Michael. They dispatched ships and helicopters and planes. They got in touch with the US Navy and got them to be fully involved. I mean, they looked everywhere for weeks, but they could not find Michael. This search for Michael would continue for years. No, it wouldn't be as intense as the first few weeks, but there was always somebody or some entity looking for Michael around the area where he had begun that swim. But by 1964, so 3 years after Michael had begun the swim to shore, the Rockefeller family finally accepted that Michael had to be dead, that he had to have drowned on that 5 or 10 mile swim to shore, and when the family finally kind of accepted that, that is what happened, that became the story in America about what happened to Michael Rockefeller. In fact, his sister even wrote a best-selling book about grieving his loss. But in New Guinea, a very different story began to spread about what happened to Michael. Rumors about his fate were whispered along trade routes and between visiting missionaries, and gossiped about in tabloid and adventure magazines. In 1916, so 5 years after Michael was declared dead by his family, an adventure magazine reporter named Milt Macklin heard from this mysterious Australian person who was a source for this magazine that they had actually run into Michael Rockefeller recently in the jungle of New Guinea, not far from where he supposedly disappeared. And Milt would actually follow up on this tip, despite how not credible it was, and he would go to New Guinea with a film crew, and he would go to this area, and he would look everywhere for Michael. He would talk to locals. He really scoured the area, but there was no sign of Michael. And so Milt, feeling very let down by this, he came back home and he actually wrote a best-selling book about his quest to find Michael Rockefeller. But crucially, even though he had shot all this footage, both at a distance and up close, of all these tribes in the area where Michael supposedly was, he and his team never really reviewed the footage. They basically shot all this footage while they were there looking for Michael, couldn't find him, and said MEH, and put the footage aside. But 40 years later, another documentary film crew decided they were going to go to New Guinea and look for Michael because there were still all these rumors floating around that Michael was alive and living in the jungles of New Guinea. And before they actually went to New Guinea to go looking for Michael, they uncovered this unwatched footage from Milt Macklin, and they watched all of it. And they discovered something unbelievable. Amongst the hours and hours of footage, there's this brief shot taken from a distance where the film crew was shooting on land out towards the water. And you see this canoe come into frame, and it's full of Asmat tribe warriors. This is a war party, and they're making their way presumably into battle with some other tribe. But amongst these big, strong men is one man who totally stands out because he doesn't look like the other Asmat warriors. He is a naked, bearded white man who, again, even though the quality of the film was poor, he totally looked like Michael Rockefeller. And so, as soon as word got out about this footage, very quickly, rumors began to spread all around the world about how this heir to a billionaire's fortune had decided to turn away from his family and just live amongst the Asmat tribe as one of theirs. Now again, we have no idea if that really was Michael Rockefeller. It could easily have been, a missionary or some other white person that happened to be in New Guinea, but the story was incredible, and so it spread everywhere. In 2012, so for years after this unwatched Milt Macklin footage came to light, and over 50 years since Michael Rockefeller actually went missing, a National Geographic journalist named Carl Hoffman, who had grown up totally fascinated by the mystery surrounding Michael Rockefeller, he decided that he would go to New Guinea and finally get to the bottom of what happened to Michael Rockefeller. And after Carl and his interpreter went to New Guinea and lived with the Asmat tribe for months and gained their trust and gained their respect, they began to tell him a brand new story that he had never heard before about what happened to Michael, the real story. And they gave him a dire warning that if he ever told anyone what actually happened to Michael, that the whole village would likely be killed and maybe even he too would be killed. But Carl didn't listen. After hearing what really happened to Michael, he left New Guinea and wrote a book about it called Savage Harvest. And from his book, here is what happened to Michael Rockefeller. On the morning of November 19th, 1961, so roughly 24 hours after Michael had jumped into the water and began this 5 to 10-mile swim to shore to get help, 3 Asmat tribe elders named Finn, Jim, and Pepsin amongst 50 other tribe members in 8 long canoes. And they weren't going anywhere. They were just kind of resting at the mouth of this river, the same river that dumped out into the All-Four Sea, which is exactly where Michael and his crew had run into all those rough waters and overturned, causing their whole situation. And so all these tribespeople are just sitting there in their canoes. Some of them are smoking loosely wrapped cigars, others are chewing on flour made from a palm plant called sago. And they're all naked, minus a couple of bands around their knees and their elbows, and some of them had very intricate piercings in their noses and their ears. But they're all just kind of sitting there. It was a long day, and they're enjoying some peace and quiet. But then suddenly Jim, one of the elders, noticed something making its way into the river from the sea. It was this white thing kind of slithering towards them. And immediately Jim called out to the others to look. There's something over there. It's a white crocodile. It's a serpent. It's something. And they all look and they're watching. And slowly this white thing is moving its way closer and closer to them. And so, not wanting to be caught off guard, the entire group got ready and began paddling over to see what this thing was, because if it was a threat, They could deal with it. If it wasn't, so be it. And so, as these 8 canoes converged on this white thing, some of them had their spears up, ready to attack. But when they finally saw what this creature was, they realized it was not some serpent or crocodile or something. It was a white man, and he was floating on his back, and he had these weird flotation devices on, but he was not a threat. And so right away, all the tribesmen, they put down their spears, they kind of laughed, thinking that they were in danger for a second. And this white man, who was Michael Rockefeller, he rolled over and he looked up, and he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He's just swam like 10 miles to get here, and he's seeing the tribe that he had come to see in the first place. They've come here to rescue him. And so, practically crying with relief, he turned around and grabbed one of their canoes. And as soon as he did, one of the elders, Pep, looked down at Michael holding onto his boat, and then Pep looked up at the other 2 elders, Finn and Jim. They just stared at each other, then back at Michael, then back at each other, and then they nodded in agreement. And then Pep helped Michael into the boat. Michael immediately just laid in the middle of the boat. He was so exhausted from that swim, but he was so relieved and he just laid there while the tribe kind of got back into position. They turned their canoes around and began paddling back up the river, back inland. And as they paddled, they began this very strange chant. All 8 canoes, all 50 members of the tribe, all in unison, began this chant. And Michael, he had studied the Asmat tribe and felt like he knew a lot about their culture, but he had never heard this particular chant before, and so he was enchanted by it. And he tried to ask them, what does this mean? But they just completely ignored Michael and just continued to paddle and chant. And so Michael just laid there listening, getting carried along to safety. When all of a sudden the chanting stopped, and the canoes turned and kind of made their way into this little inlet that led to a clearing right on the shore. And so Michael noticed they were slowing down, and so he kind of barely got up and looked over the edge of the canoe to see if they were at their village. But when he looked up, he saw there was no village in sight. It was just this clearing out on the shore. And right away, Michael's like, well, I hope we're going to the village soon, because I have to find someone who can get in touch with the authorities, who can then go and rescue Renee and hopefully find Simon and Leo as well. And so Michael began trying to ask the men in his canoe if they would help him, but there was, of course, a massive language barrier and neither side really understood the other. And then, at some point, one of the men from the Asmat tribe just began laughing at Michael. And when he did, the majority of the rest of the tribe looked over, saw what was going on, and they too began laughing at Michael. And so Michael had no idea what was going on, and then, before he could do anything else, the entire tribe stopped laughing. And it was like in an instant, they were back into that rhythmic chanting as they slowly began making their way out of their canoes, making their way onto shore. And so Michael began to sense that something was wrong. And instead of getting out of the canoe with the rest of the tribe, he kind of instinctively laid back down on the canoe, almost like he was trying to get away from them. And when he did that, the tribesman who had first laughed at Michael, he stood right over Michael as he's doing this chant. And he smiled at Michael and then he raised his spear and he drove it into Michael's side. And the second he did that, other members of the tribe raised these horns they were carrying and began blasting into their horns. And so Michael is screaming out in pain, but he's got no strength to defend himself. And so he kind of like rolled over onto the other side on this canoe, kind of trying to protect himself. And when he did that, the guy just lifted his spear again with a big smile on his face and drove it into Michael's other side. After the man pulled the spear out, Michael, who's in horrible pain, managed, perhaps with his adrenaline, to pull himself up and over the side of the canoe. So he fell out onto the mud, and he tried to stand up to get away from them, but there was nowhere he could go away from them. And so, as he's kind of fumbling in the mud, 2 of the tribesmen walked up behind him, grabbed him under the arms, and they began carrying him across the clearing towards the jungle. And as they walked, that rhythmic chanting continued, and periodically Michael would hear someone blast on their horn. And so Michael was dragged across the shoreline, into the jungle, and then finally to another clearing in the jungle, not anywhere near their village. and Michael was positioned in the middle of this clearing and put on his knees. So Michael is kind of guarding his sides with his arms. He's incredibly weak, he's on his knees. The tribe kind of formed a circle around him, and they're continuing this chant. And then at some point, one of the tribesmen walked up to Michael, grabbed his head, and pushed it forward, exposing the back of his neck. And then another tribe member walked in, and again, the whole time this chanting is going on, horns are being blown, and this other tribesman comes up and he raises an axe and he brings it down on the back of Michael's neck. It would turn out the Asmat tribe knew who Michael was. They remembered him from his visits several months earlier when he had attempted to barter for their best poles. And they had been totally offended that this rich white man had shown up and thought he could just buy one of their sacred artifacts like it was some trinket to be put on display in a museum. And so they had held on to a deep hatred for him. That was why they didn't send their best pole to him. They weren't going to give it to him. But when Michael had kind of magically floated into their riverend, suddenly the Asmat tribe has him sitting in their canoe. The three village elders, Finn, Jim, and Pep, they all just kind of looked at each other and nodded in agreement that they were going to ritualistically kill Michael to avenge the deaths of many of their fallen warriors. This poles apparently contained the souls of because many of their warriors had been killed by white men in the past, and so Michael was going to be their way to avenge their souls. And so that chant that Michael heard them all saying, that was the chant they did when they performed this execution ritual. Except they didn't just kill Michael. After one of those tribesmen brought the axe down on the back of Michael's neck, another tribesman walked up and grabbed Michael's hair, pulled his head back, and used a knife to slash at his throat to actually remove his head. And then, after his head was removed, again, with all the chanting continuing in a circle the whole time, members of the tribe came up and began cutting Michael's body absolutely to pieces, separating his organs and his flesh and his bones into different piles. And then, very quickly, they got a fire going and cooked and ate Michael. And of all the parts of his body that were eaten, his brain was apparently the most important. And so only Finn, Jim, and Pep, the three elders, were allowed to eat the brain. And then finally, after they had finished eating and took all the remaining meat that had not been consumed in, they put it into their pouches to eat later. Finn, one of the elders, took Michael's skull and he would bring it back to the village. And he would cover it in banana leaves and he would paint it and treat it like a trophy. A few days later, when that huge search party came through the area looking for Michael, the Asmat tribe knew they could never whisper a word about what happened to Michael, because if it got out, it's very likely that Westerners would want to retaliate against them. And so for decades and decades, their secret stayed safe until Carl Hoffman of the National Geographic heard the story and then wrote the book about it, Savage Harvest. But despite publishing this book and lots of people reading it, there was always some question about the credibility of the story. Because remember, there's all this intrigue and mystery around Michael's story to begin with, and now we have this account coming from the Asmat tribe. And so no one really knew how legitimate it was. And so, to this day, the Rockefeller family and, generally speaking, authorities at large, still say that Michael Rockefeller drowned on his swim to shore trying to get help. And that's it. Today's episode is a fan favorite. The audio in the story has been remastered for today's episode. One September afternoon in 2003, a woman in Tucson, Arizona heard a knock on her front door and she answered it. And she was surprised to see a Tucson police detective standing on her front steps, and even more surprised when he started asking her a bunch of questions about her next-door neighbor. Now, the woman tried to be as helpful as she could, but, she just didn't have very good answers to this detective's questions. She really didn't know much about her neighbor. And so, ultimately, the detective gave her his business card and told her to call back if she ever heard anything, or saw anything, or remembered anything unusual about her neighbor. Now, this woman didn't expect to ever call this detective back. That was until a few days later, when she looked out her window and saw the sweaty men jump out of a van and walk up the steps into her neighbor's house. And the woman just stood there for several minutes, absolutely shocked, her heart racing, realizing what she was watching. Moments later, the woman picked up that business card and called the detective. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast. Because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please secretly attach a harmonica to the front of the Follow Buttons car, so that everywhere they go, their car whistles. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of Wednesday, September 24th, 2003, 45-year-old Michael Albert Doha, UCQZ, laid down flat on his back on his yoga mat in front of a room full of his students at a yoga studio in downtown Tucson, Arizona. The students all followed Michael's lead, laying down for a pose called Shavasana, which signaled the end of a long workout. Michael loved this final pose because it was all about meditation, and it really helped him get centered for his day. And after a few minutes in this pose, when he sat up and told his students to rise as well, he felt both exhausted and recharged. He got to his feet and smiled at his class as everyone else rolled up their yoga mats and got ready to leave. Although Michael was a machinist by trade and spent his work days in a shop tinkering with tools and small engines, he was actually a very artistic and kind of Zen person. He spent his free time giving music lessons on his guitar, and he also taught 15 different yoga classes every week in various gyms and studios all across Tucson. His genuine enthusiasm about the physical, mental, and spiritual benefits of yoga were very infectious, and it put many of his students at ease around him. In fact, they were so comfortable with him that they called him M, which was short for his three initials, Michael Albert Doha UCQZ. Michael Tao laid the sweat off his face and looked up at the clock on the wall. It was almost 7:00 p.m. and his stomach was beginning to rumble. So he asked the class, as they were getting ready to go, if anybody was feeling up to grabbing some food and a few drinks, which was actually a question they were all expecting because hanging out socially was something that this Wednesday group typically did each week after their workout. One student immediately shouted out that they would, and a few others raised their hands as well. So, Michael suggested they all meet at a bar on 4th Avenue, not far from where the yoga studio was located. The students that were going all nodded their heads in agreement, and then all of them, the ones who were going and the ones who were not, all shuffled through the studio's door and outside to the parking lot. But before Michael shut off the studio lights and followed the group outside, he picked up his cell phone and called his girlfriend, Amber Tro. He'd been seeing her off and on for about a year after first meeting her through his yoga lessons. Recently, things had been a bit rocky between Amber and Michael, but Michael still wanted to invite her out for dinner and drinks. He figured that by having her be a part of a big group setting out at a public place, that would sort of give them a chance to have fun without the opportunity to argue, since if they argued it would be in front of everyone, so that was a natural deterrent. After a few rings, Amber answered her phone and Michael told her, very enthusiastically, about his plans and said that he would love it if she came out with them. But Amber hesitated and Michael, frankly, knew why. In addition to the problems they were having in their relationship, Amber was just a very shy person. She preferred private lessons with Michael rather than being a part of a big group where you had all these other people sort of watching you stretch for an hour. But after a few seconds of awkward silence on the line, Amber said that she actually would meet up with Michael and his students at the bar. Michael was thrilled and told Amber he would see her there. Then he ended the call, shut off the lights in the studio, and walked out the door into the parking lot, thinking about Amber. Michael and Amber were opposites, but that didn't really bother Michael. It also didn't bother him when Amber teased him about how he dressed like a hippie with his long hair and beaded necklace and sandals. Michael could take a joke, and above all, he liked to have fun, which in his mind was what he was doing with an attractive woman like Amber, who was actually 17 years younger than he was younger. Their relationship really was pretty casual, and Michael intended to keep it that way. He'd been married twice already and was a father to 3 kids, as well as a grandfather, and at this point in his life, he did not want to be tied down anymore. Amber, on the other hand, she did want to get serious. She kept asking Michael to marry her, and every few weeks she'd break up with him for saying no. And so Michael knew that their relationship status would likely come up tonight in conversation. But since there were other people going out with them, he figured maybe he could dodge an argument about it. A few minutes later, Michael walked into the bar on 4th Street and found 5 of his students already sitting at a table. He sat down and ordered a drink, and shortly after that, Michael looked up to see Amber walking through the front door of the bar. He stood up from a table, gave her a big hug, and then invited her to take a spot right next to him. From that point on, the group ordered some food and they drank and talked and goofed around until around 8:30 at night, when folks started getting tired. At that point, they all paid their checks and then they left. Now, most of the students were heading home at this point, but Michael, Amber, and one of the students, Michael's friend, Eli, decided to continue their night and go have a few more drinks at another bar. So the 3 of them went to another establishment until around 10:00 p.m. and at that point, Eli decided it was time for him to call it a night. He took some cash from his wallet, put it down on the table, and then he headed home, leaving just Michael and Amber at the bar. And now that the couple was all alone, just as Michael expected, they began to fight. And so Michael began drinking faster and ordering more drinks for Amber, hoping that maybe more alcohol for both of them would mellow them out of the mouth. 2 hours later, at midnight, when the bartender turned the lights off and then back on again, and then announced out loud it was last call, both Michael and Amber were pretty drunk. Michael yawned, finished the rest of the drink in his glass, and asked Amber to come back to his house with him. She said she would. And so Michael and Amber paid their tab and then walked out the front door into the night. Shortly afterwards, the 2 of them stumbled up the walkway and onto the front porch of Michael's house at 2602 North Sparkman Boulevard. Michael unlocked the door and then he and Amber stepped into the kitchen. A day and a half later, on Friday, September 26th at around 6:30 in the morning, a woman was walking her dog along North Sparkman Boulevard in Tucson. The street was in a pretty rough neighborhood where there were lots of burglaries and muggings, and so most people kind of kept to themselves when they were passing through. Usually, the woman walked her dog at a fast pace with her head down, avoiding eye contact with other pedestrians and avoiding looking into other people's properties. However, when the woman passed in front of No. 2602, something caught her attention. Just beyond some brush obscuring the front patio, she saw a flash of something light-colored that was obviously not vegetation. She turned her head to look and blinked for a second in confusion because what she was looking at didn't make sense. It was a person's bare legs and shorts, splayed out on the patio. Now, the weather had been excruciatingly hot and muggy and stifling for the last few days, including today's, so the woman at first thought that maybe this person up on the porch had passed out from the heat. Now, as soon as she thought that, her first instinct was to walk up and investigate and make sure this person was okay. But since this was not really a safe neighborhood, the idea of just strolling up to some stranger's property seemed kind of risky. But just then, she saw another man walking on the street towards his car and she called out to him and pointed over at the legs on the patio and asked if he would go see what was the matter. The man looked over at the house and saw what the woman was pointing at, sort of looked puzzled for a second. Then he turned back to the woman and gave a thumbs up like, "Yep, I'll go check it out." Then the man walked over to the porch. The woman watched as the man walked up to the porch and, right as he got close to the legs, he called out the name Michael. And then the man who was doing this checkup, he began backing up and then he turned and actually started running back towards the woman. And as he passed her, he just said, "I'm calling 911. Not long after that man called 911, Detective Ben Jimenez of the Tucson Police Department drove down North Sparkman Boulevard in his cruiser. He came to a stop just outside of No. 2602, put his cruiser in park, and cut the engine. Around him, he saw other squad cars and ambulances doing the same thing. Jimenez stepped out of his air-conditioned cruiser into the hot, muggy morning air. He took off his suit jacket and tossed it onto the driver's seat and then shut the door. He rolled up the sleeves of his white dress shirt, loosened his tie, and then walked from the curb up to the porch of the house until he was standing next to the dead body of a man who was lying face up and wearing yoga pants and a tank top. Jimenez was not the first member of the Tucson PD on the scene, and one of the other officers who was already there told him that the body he was looking at belonged to the home's resident, who was named Michael Doha, UCQZ. The officer told Jimenez that the rest of the property was empty. Michael was their only victim. Jimenez put on a pair of disposable gloves and squatted down next to the body. He could see there was a single bullet wound in the center of Michael's forehead. Around the bullet wound, Jimenez could see a black star-shaped gunpowder burn. There was lots of dried blood on the porch floor around the head, and more blood on Michael's clothes and legs. Jimenez mentioned to the officer to be on the lookout for any shell casings. Then, Jimenez put his hand up to Michael's exposed skin and found that it was actually still warm. The fact the body had not gone cold yet suggested that Michael may have been killed only a few hours earlier, probably in the early hours of Friday morning. Jimenez looked at Michael's hands and saw that they were covered in scratches, which told him that Michael very likely must have fought with his attacker. Jimenez stood back up, but just as he was about to walk inside the house, he stopped because he noticed that some guitar and violin cases were haphazardly stacked up outside on the porch. And this struck him as odd because nobody in this neighborhood would ever store expensive musical equipment outside, or really anything sort of like obviously expensive outside because it could get stolen. But regardless, Jimenez stepped through the front door and into the kitchen, and as he did, he saw more music gear. This time, it was an amplifier and a guitar stand that had been left to the side of the door just inside the house. On the floor near the gear, Jimenez saw broken glass from a shattered window pane. And so, already, Jimenez was beginning to develop a theory. He wondered if maybe Michael had interrupted a robbery. Maybe the thief or thieves had been in the process of shuffling the musical equipment out of the house onto the porch gate, kind of stacking it up near the door as they were doing it, when Michael came out and confronted them. The broken glass in the kitchen suggested that the fight maybe started there, or at least in part happened right there, and then from there, they moved through the door onto the porch where Michael was ultimately shot. And then, when Jimenez did a walkthrough of the rest of the property, he found in Michael's workshop that it was perfectly intact, and none of the very obviously expensive tools had been taken or moved. And so to Jimenez, this cemented his theory that very likely Michael had interrupted a robbery. And so very likely, at least according to Jimenez's theory, after the robber shot Michael, he figured that they must have panicked and then just taken off without finishing the job. By this point, the crime scene was swarming with members of the forensics unit and also uniformed officers. Jimenez knew it would take hours to process the scene for blood, fingerprints, and other trace evidence. And also, officers were already out knocking on doors in the neighborhood looking for witnesses. So Jimenez decided to leave and go talk to detectives in the burglary division to see if they had any similar cases or usual suspects. Back inside the headquarters, Detective Jimenez walked quickly to the burglary division. He rapped on the open door of one of the offices there and caught the attention of a detective at a desk. Jimenez explained the case he just caught, laid out his theory about a home robbery gone wrong, and then asked the detective if he had any recent robberies on or around North Sparkman Boulevard. And the second Jimenez mentioned North Sparkman Boulevard, he saw this detective's eyes light up. He shot straight up in his chair and very excitedly said that, yes, he did in fact have something. Just 5 days earlier, on Sunday, he had arrested two men, Joseph Keyes and David Wynn, for robbing a home in that exact same neighborhood. But that wasn't all. First of all, Keyes and Wynn lived in a house that was just a mile away from Michael's place. And most importantly, one of the items these two men had stolen was a guitar. Jimenez knew this was a great starting point, so he got Keyes and Wynn's home address from the detective. Then Jimenez returned to his own desk and began filling out an application for a search warrant. While he waited for a judge to approve his request, Jimenez's phone rang. It was one of the officers who'd been knocking on doors over on North Sparkman Boulevard. The officer told Jimenez that nobody in the area heard any gunshots or any unusual noises coming from Michael's house early on Friday morning, and nobody seemed to have seen Michael at all for a day or two. However, one neighbor told police that on Thursday afternoon, Michael must have been working in his workshop because they'd heard his compressor going. So, the neighborhood canvass had not produced a witness to the killing, but they were starting to build a picture of Michael's final hours. Jimenez thanked the officer for the good work and hung up the phone feeling satisfied, less than 1 full day into his investigation, and he already had a very promising working theory. He had a search warrant application out to a judge and he was refining, his victim's final moments to really get a sense of what actually happened here. But for now, it was late in the evening, and he knew he had a long day ahead of him tomorrow. So he shut down his computer and left his office. The next morning was Saturday, and Detective Jimenez arrived at his office to find that his search warrant application for the home of Joseph Keyes and David Wynn had been approved. He also found a copy of the autopsy report waiting for him, along with a couple of reports from other detectives who had begun to reach out to Michael's friends and family. Now, Jimenez was very eager to go search Wynn and Keyes' house, but first he picked up the autopsy report, flipped it open, and gave it a quick read. The coroner had found a .38 caliber bullet lodged in Michael's brain. The star-shaped gunpowder burn around the entry wound meant it had been fired at close range, which Jimenez had already guessed. And also, the coroner noted that the wounds on Michael's hands were indeed very likely defensive wounds. The most useful part of the report focused on Michael's time of death. When Jimenez got to the scene and he touched Michael's body, it was warm to the touch, and so he had assumed that very likely Michael had died recently. Jimenez just didn't know exactly when, and the coroner was able to confirm that suspicion because Michael had not yet gone through rigor mortis. The coroner was able to establish an actual time of death. Michael had been shot somewhere between 2:00 and 3:00 a.m. on Friday morning. And so, this information meant that Jimenez could be very specific when he was investigating suspect alibis. This was great news. Jimenez rifled through the other reports, which laid out a rough timeline of Michael's activities before his death. He had taught a yoga class on Wednesday night and gone out for drinks afterwards with some students and a girlfriend, who Michael's friends knew only as Amber. Then on Thursday, he'd apparently spent the entire day holed up inside of a studio working. Jimenez put the reports down. He'd have to work on tracking down Amber later, but for now that was not his priority. Instead, he'd gathered up a team of officers and drove over to the home of Joseph Keyes and David Wynn. When they got there, they knocked on the door. They didn't get an answer, and so, eventually, they forced their way inside, and immediately, they discovered that there was nobody home. However, pretty quickly, once Jimenez walked into the kitchen, he knew coming to this house had put him on the right track because, in the kitchen, there was this very random-looking pile of clothes. Jimenez put on his gloves, squatted down, and one by one he picked up a bandana, a pair of pants, and some shoes, and he saw that every item in this pile was splattered with blood. Jimenez was thinking that at this point, all he would need to do to close his case was get these items over to forensics and match the blood on these to the blood of his victim. But the next morning, when Jimenez walked into his office, he got to pieces of bad news, one right after the next. The first piece of bad news was that the forensics did not match. The blood found on the bandana, the pants, and the shoes was the wrong type. It didn't belong to Michael. And the second piece of bad news was that, even though Joseph Keyes and David Wynn appeared to be the perfect suspects on paper for this murder robbery, detectives had found one big problem. When Michael was shot early on Friday morning, Keyes and Wynn were both already sitting inside of a jail cell. And so, just 2 days after Michael's body was found, Detective Jimenez found himself back at square one. Jimenez sat at his desk, flipping through reports from the crime scene and hoping he'd stumble upon a detail that maybe he missed. And after about an hour of doing that, he did find something. On a list of items found inside of Michael's house, Jimenez saw a cell phone. At this time in 2003, not everybody had a cell phone yet, so it wasn't something police immediately looked for when they arrived on a crime scene. Also, cell phones at this time did not contain the kind of evidence that they would today. There was no internet access on any of them, and people didn't send a whole bunch of text messages or really use them nearly as much as we do now. So Jimenez got up from his desk and walked to the evidence room to get the cell phone. And once he had it, he went straight to the single most useful piece of information the phone contained, and that was the call log contained. The detective began scrolling through the list of people Michael had spoken to before he died, and at the top of that list was the phone number for a contact listed as Amber Truttle. Jimenez read the name and immediately felt a jolt of excitement. Michael's friends had said that his girlfriend was named Amber. He had meant to track her down, and now he was staring down at, very likely, her phone number. Jimenez took the cell phone and went back to his desk. There, he used his own phone to dial Amber's phone number, but there was no answer. It just rang and finally went to voicemail, which was very disappointing. So, Jimenez left a voicemail and asked Amber to please call him back at her earliest convenience. After he hung up, Jimenez just stared at the call history list again. And as he did, he noticed something curious. Michael had been killed on Friday morning, but his last call, which was to Amber, was made on Wednesday night. It seemed bizarre to Jimenez that there was this weird gap in time leading up to Michael's death. It was hard to imagine that all day Thursday, Michael hadn't spoken to anyone. And as he thought about this, he also found it to be kind of suspicious that Amber had not already come forward to talk to the police, considering that her boyfriend had been murdered. And so Jimenez began dialing numbers from Michael's contact list in his phone, including Michael's ex-wives and his adult kids, asking about Amber, looking for any information he could get. But it seemed like no one really had any information about who this person was and what her role was in Michael's life. So, by the time Sunday came to a close, Jimenez had a new hunch about where he should focus his investigation on his victim's girlfriend, Amber. The next morning, on Monday, when Amber still had not returned Jimenez's phone calls, he tried her again. And this time, his call went straight to voicemail instead of ringing like it had the day before. This meant her phone had shut off. Jimenez wasn't sure what to make of this. It was possible that Amber's cell phone had simply run out of batteries. In 2003, that wasn't that unusual, to have your phone die and just sort of go without your phone for a while. Also, people did periodically just turn their phone off and not return calls. It was just a different time. But with every hour that went by that day without getting a call back from Amber, Jimenez couldn't help but get more suspicious. Finally, the next day, on Tuesday, Jimenez got a phone call. When he picked it up, he hoped it was going to be Amber. But it wasn't Amber. It was Amber's boss, who Jimenez didn't know and had not called. And Amber's boss, who said she had heard about the murder on TV, had a story that changed everything Jimenez thought he knew about this case. The boss said that Amber worked for her as a bookkeeper at a charity called Child and Family Resources, and Amber was usually very reliable. But on Thursday, so a day before the murder, Amber had called out of work for what she said was a family emergency. She had been supposed to return a day ago on Monday, but she hadn't shown up, and so Jimenez scribbled all this down. Thinking that Amber did seem to make a pretty good suspect after all. But then Amber's boss said there was one more thing. Amber's relationship with Michael was not a typical boyfriend-girlfriend relationship. It was an affair. Amber was married. Less than an hour later, Detective Jimenez walked into the air-conditioned bagel shop where Amber's boss had said that Amber's husband worked. After he had wrapped up the call with Amber's boss, Jimenez was left with a feeling of whiplash. Until her boss had told him about the husband, he had been viewing Amber as a possible suspect, and a good one. But now, he was starting to wonder if maybe she was some kind of a victim after all. Right now, she was still unaccounted for. Nobody had heard from her. And this affair certainly gave her husband a very solid motive to potentially harm her or harm Michael, or both. All Amber's boss had known about Amber's husband was his name, Justin Goodwin, and his place of employment, this bagel shop. However, when Jimenez asked the employee at the counter if Justin Goodwin was working, the employee looked surprised and kind of nervous, and just shook his head and said, "No." Then he told Jimenez to wait and left the counter to go into an office in the back. And then, after a minute, another man walked out to the counter and introduced himself as the manager. And he told Jimenez that he was sorry, but Justin had worked here, but he quit his job very suddenly just the day before. To Jimenez, it was sort of head spinning how quickly this new theory that Justin could be involved here was picking up steam. So, he asked the manager if he knew anything about Justin's wife, Amber, and the manager made a sort of pained expression. He told Jimenez that all he knew was that their relationship seemed very tumultuous. In fact, Justin had once missed work because he'd been arrested for domestic violence. Jimenez could barely contain his eagerness as he asked the manager for Justin's address. Then, after he got it, he left the bagel shop and sped to the home of his new prime suspect. But when Jimenez arrived, the lights were off in the house, the driveway was empty, and nobody answered the door. And so Jimenez walked around to a few of the nearby houses and spoke to the neighbors, sweating in the heat the whole time. But they all said that they hadn't seen Amber or Justin for at least a few days. Disappointed, Jimenez gave them all his card and asked them to call him if they remembered anything or if they saw or heard anything out of the ordinary. For the next 3 days, Jimenez and his team searched for Amber and Justin and put out notifications to neighboring police departments to be on the lookout for them. But he didn't make any progress until Friday, October 3rd, exactly 1 week after the murder, when one of the neighbors whose doors he had knocked on called him back. It was a woman, and she sounded breathless and excited. She told Jimenez that he had to come back to Justin's house right now because, at this very moment, she was standing at her window and watching as Justin and another man were taking all the furniture out of Justin's home and loading it into a rental van. Jimenez immediately ran out of his office, hopped in his cruiser, and he sped over to Justin's house. And when he got there, he saw a man who he instantly recognized from the mugshots as Justin himself. And just like the neighbor had said, Justin clearly was taking furniture from his house and putting it into this van. Jimenez hopped out of his cruiser, quickly identified himself as a detective, and asked Justin what he was doing and where his wife was. Immediately, Justin looked nervous. He told Jimenez he was moving, which certainly wasn't illegal, and as for his wife, he said he had no idea. He said they were getting a divorce and she was on her own. Then Justin did something that caught Jimenez totally by surprise. It was swelteringly hot outside, and at some point, Justin lifted up his shirt to wipe the sweat off his face. And when he did, Jimenez saw tucked in Justin's waistband was a gun. Now, Jimenez had no idea if Justin had a license to carry this gun, but considering the entire circumstances, it was too much to overlook, and he told Justin he had to come down to the station and answer some questions. Once they were at the station, Jimenez led Justin into an interview room. At this point, the red flags around Justin were almost comically conspicuous. He had been arrested for domestic violence in the past. His wife was having an affair, and now she was missing and her affair partner had been shot to death. Justin had quit his job and cleaned out the house where he and Amber lived, all while armed with a gun. So when Jimenez sat down at the table inside of this interview room, he felt pretty confident that he had his killer right in front of him. Jimenez handed Justin a bottle of water and then began asking him questions, starting with, did he know a man named Michael Doha UCQZ? Jimenez watched as Justin took the cap off his water and raised it to his mouth before answering, and he saw that Justin's hand was visibly shaking. After a second, Justin, no, he didn't know anybody by that name. When Jimenez followed up and said that Michael and Amber were having an affair, Justin denied knowing that to it. He said that he and Amber clearly were having problems. I mean, they were getting a divorce, but those problems had nothing to do with anybody named Michael. He swore. Again, he really had no idea where Amber was and insisted that all of the incriminating facts that seemed to surround him were just a coincidence. Right as Jimenez was starting to get frustrated with Justin, feeling like he was blatantly lying to him, there was a knock on the interview room door. Jimenez turned around to see another officer step inside, holding up Justin's cell phone, which they had confiscated along with Justin's gun when they questioned him. The officer apologized for interrupting, but asked Jimenez if he could please step out of the room and speak to him for a moment. Jimenez got up and left the interview room, and the officer handed him Justin's cell phone. He explained that the whole time Jimenez had been questioning Justin, it had been ringing incessantly and, finally, he had just picked it up. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman, and she had hung up as soon as he, the officer, had identified himself as police. However, the officer had traced the phone number and found that it belonged to the extended stay America Hotel right there in Dasan. Jimenez could not believe his luck. Whoever that was calling Justin, if he could just catch them before they left that hotel, they might be able to give him some real answers about what Justin had been up to for the past few days. So, Jimenez asked the officer to keep an eye on Justin because he was going to go track down this mystery caller. A half an hour later, Jimenez was offering a pleasant but very impatient smile to the employee behind the front desk at the extended stay America Hotel. The detective had no way of knowing what room the mystery calls had come from, so the employee was looking it up for him, but it was taking forever. Finally, though, the employee looked up and said he did have a woman staying in the room where the calls came from, and the employee said that woman's name was Amber Truttle. Detective Jimenez would take Amber back to the police station and would spend the next several hours angling her story. And just then, the detective's murder case was changing faster than he could even keep up with. First, it had looked like a robbery and he'd had to slam dunk suspects, but that had fallen apart in days. Then he had Amber Truttle, the suspicious girlfriend, who he thought maybe was dodging his calls because she was guilty. But Amber had turned out to be missing and a possible victim. That revelation had given him Justin Goodwin, the jealous husband. But just as Jimenez had thought he was closing it on Justin for killing Michael, and maybe even Amber too, Amber herself had reappeared, holed up in a hotel and calling Justin over and over again. Whatever Justin and Amber were relationship-wise, they apparently were not totally broken up yet. And so now, Jimenez was considering yet another theory, that maybe Justin and Amber had killed Michael together. He figured he could put them both in separate interview rooms, take each of their statements, and then grill them on the inconsistencies that he was absolutely certain he was going to find. But that didn't happen to him, and as a shock, Justin and Amber's stories matched each other perfectly. Yes, they said they were having marital problems, and yes, they saw how suspicious all their behavior looked between Justin quitting his job and lying to police about where Amber was, and Amber abandoning her job and ignoring all of Jimenez's calls while hiding in a hotel. But they swore they didn't kill Michael, and they had alibis to prove it. Because on Thursday morning, so almost a full 24 hours before the murder, they had left Tucson, headed 3.5 hours north to a mountain town called Show Low, Arizona, where Justin's mother and stepfather lived. They told Jimenez to call Justin's parents and check for himself. And so, Jimenez did just that, not really sure what to expect. You know, he didn't really have high hopes here that they were going to actually be able to confirm their alibi. But it would turn out that Justin's stepfather was a retired police detective, and he was very straightforward and specific about the timeline. And even though this kind of poked a hole in his whole case, Jimenez believed him. And so, this meant that between the hours of 2:00 and 3:00 on Friday, when Michael was shot to death, Amber and Justin were almost 200 miles away. And not only that, but Justin's gun that had been such a red flag was not the same caliber as the murder weapon. And so Jimenez's best suspects were just more dead ends. Jimenez let Amber and Justin leave the police station, and he went back to his desk, where he slumped in his chair and stared miserably at nothing. By now, it was late in the day and Jimenez had no new ideas. His case was turning out to be much more complicated than he had initially thought, and now nothing was making any sense. And so he figured, what he really needed to do now was just take the weekend and look at the case with fresh eyes on Monday. There had to be something he was missing, some piece of evidence that he was either misinterpreting or missing altogether. He decided he would make one more phone call and then head home. He picked up the phone on his desk and dialed the number for the coroner's office, and, like he expected on a Friday night, nobody picked up. So he left a voicemail asking the coroner to take one more look at all the Michael Doha UCQZ evidence. He explained he wasn't totally sure what he was looking for, but something just didn't feel right. And he wanted the coroner to look really closely one more time so that he had sort of a good starting point on Monday. Then Jimenez hung up the phone, picked up his jacket, and headed home. The tip that would break this case wide open came early the following week, but the tip didn't come from the coroner. It was a phone call from someone Detective Jimenez had spoken to already in this investigation, and who he never expected to hear from again. This person said that Jimenez had to come meet with them right now, and Jimenez didn't hesitate because what this person had to say didn't make sense with the rest of the evidence that the detective had. But the detective no longer trusted all of his evidence. He was sure there was something wrong with his facts. He just wasn't sure what it was. And so, maybe this was part of it. Jimenez drove out to meet the person who called him, and the person took him for a walk. They said they wanted to show him a hole that they had found in the dirt. And when Jimenez got to that hole, he stood there panting in the warm air, and he realized that, finally, He knew who his murderer was. He just had to figure out how this was possible. And this is where the coroner came in, because shortly after Jimenez got back to the station, the coroner called to tell Jimenez that he had been right. They had all misinterpreted one very important piece of evidence. The truth had been right in front of them all along. They just hadn't put it together. Based on evidence collected over the course of a few weeks and the revised results of the autopsy, this is what police believe happened to Michael Doha UCQZ on the morning that he was killed. It was 1:30 in the morning, and Michael had just confronted his killer in the messy kitchen of his home. The killer was enraged, and the two of them were standing near the sink, shouting at each other. At some point, the killer grabbed a glass and threw it at Michael, but Michael managed to dodge it, and the glass hit a window pane near the front door, shattering glass all over the ground. Michael was about to step towards the killer to stop them from throwing anything else at him, but there was something he didn't realize. The killer was hiding a revolver. And suddenly, the killer drew their weapon, and when Michael saw it, he rushed forward to try to wrench it out of their hands. They struggled, but Michael couldn't get a hold of the gun, and they wrestled together out the front door. And then the killer fired. Michael fell backwards onto the patio, dead. At this point, the killer looked up and down North Sparkman Boulevard to make sure nobody was around, and when they were sure, they were good. They took off running into the warm summer night. It would turn out all of Jimenez's suspects, Joseph Keyes, David Wynn, Justin Goodwin, and Amber Truttle, did have alibis for Friday, September 26, between 2:00 and 3:00 a.m., which was when the police thought Michael had been murdered. But law enforcement was wrong about Michael's time of death. The heat had fooled them. Michael was not shot to death early on Friday morning, September 26th. He was shot to death early on Thursday morning, September 25th. His body was warm when Detective Jimenez reached down to touch his skin because it had been very hot and muggy outside the whole time he was lying there. The coroner thought the body temperature, combined with the flexibility of the body, meant that death had been recent and that rigor mortis had not begun. But in reality, a hot and moist environment can cause rigor mortis to happen more quickly after death and last for a shorter period of time. So, in reality, Michael's rigor mortis had already come and gone by the time Jimenez touched his body, and so the reason he was sort of flaccid feeling is because he no longer was in rigor mortis. And so when the coroner had gone back over the evidence at Detective Jimenez's request, he found something he had missed. Michael's body had larvae in its eyes, which was an indication that he had been dead for a lot longer than a few hours. And when police went back to the crime scene, they realized that the compressor the neighbor had heard on Thursday, which caused them to think that Michael was alive and well and working in a shop that day, was actually set to refill automatically. So that noise had not meant anything at all. It did not mean that Michael was in there at work. And so the adjustment of the time of death from Friday to Thursday morning allowed Jimenez to make sense of that final phone call he got from the person had already spoken to, who called him asking to meet. That person was Justin's stepfather, the retired police officer. The stepfather had been telling the truth about the timing of Justin and Amber's visit, and that had ruled them out as suspects when the belief was Michael had been killed on Friday. But after he had gotten off the phone with Jimenez, the stepfather had followed a hunch out to the back of his property, where he discovered a hole in the dirt. And inside that hole was the murder weapon. But the person who hid the gun was not Justin. It was his soon-to-be ex-wife, Amber Truttle. On Friday, October 10th, an arrest warrant and a nationwide alert was issued for Amber, who had fled to Sama. US Marshals arrested Amber at her grandmother's house in New York. During her trial in March of 2005, Amber claimed that Michael sexually assaulted her on the night he was killed, and that he himself was actually the one who pulled the trigger during their struggle, which resulted in him being shot and killed. However, she was still convicted of second-degree murder and was sentenced to 13 years in prison. On October 19, 2016, Amber was released from prison, having served out her entire sentence. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt, produced by Jeremy Bowen. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shu, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Earl. Audio editing and post-produced by Whitlock Asio, Jordan Statham, and Cole Locasio. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Mann and Ian Dell on a Corley. Artwork by Jessica Klugstreet on Kano. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden.